Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining this event in the American Inspiration Author Series, presented by American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society. I'm Margaret Talcott, the producer of literary programs. All of us behind the scenes are delighted that you're with us tonight in the land of America's history, looking particularly at our cultural norms and at the practice of adoption. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event featuring journalist Gabrielle Glaser and her most recently published book, American Baby, A Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption. Following her presentation, Gabrielle will be in dialogue with Peter O'Dowd of WBUR Boston. I'll share their full bios in a moment, but for now, some brief housekeeping items. We are in a Zoom webinar format, which means that your microphone is muted and your video is off. While we can't take your comments in the chat box, we will share some relevant links there. We do want to hear from you though. We asked you for questions as you registered and we got many of them. Thank you so much. If you have additional questions, please enter them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Again, the Q&A, not the chat, and we'll try to slip in a few more questions. Tonight's program is being recorded by my colleagues here at the Brew Family Learning Center at American Ancestors. The video will be published in the days ahead on the American Inspiration website and as well on our education pages. We're going to share that link in the chat, and we're also going to Zoom email it to you when the video is posted. Copies of tonight's book are available from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge. You'll see on the screen the coupon code AMINS20, which is also going to be placed in the chat. Do write that down, AMINS20. If you use the code as you order, not only will the shipping fee be waived for media mail, even better, the book you receive will be signed by Gabrielle Glaser. For those whose lives have been touched by adoption, this book is essential reading. It's also a meaningful and moving study of American cultural history, the lives of women and children in the last century, and the impact on the last century on today. It's really an amazing story. Just quickly before we start, some background on tonight's presenters. Our featured guest, Gabrielle Glaser, is a New York Times bestselling author. She's also a journalist specializing in mental health, medicine, and culture. Her work has been published coast to coast, including in the New York Times and its magazine, in the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times. Gabrielle has appeared on national radio and television programs, including NPR's Fresh Air, All Things Considered, NBC's Nightly News, and ABC World News Tonight. Peter O'Dowd, our moderator, is a senior editor of the radio program Here and Now, produced by WBUR here in Boston. He was previously news director at KJZZ in Phoenix, Arizona, where he was also an editor and reporter. Peter got his start in broadcasting at Wyoming Public Radio. We truly have the whole country covered tonight. Though Gabrielle now lives in the New York area and she's joining us from there this evening. She is originally from Oregon. So indeed, coast to coast. Gabrielle, welcome. I have so enjoyed working on tonight's event with you and reading your book, which is really remarkable. I mean, hard to put down, and delving into the stories of mothers and children and pondering their dilemmas. You have done some really great reporting. So we are really looking forward to hearing from you. To folks out there, I have to say, hold on to your hats. We have some twists and turns in store for tonight, some surprise guests, but let's start with the facts of family history, America's cultural history. Gabrielle, over to you. Tell us about your book and let's get started.
Hi, Margaret. Thank you so much for that nice introduction, and I'm really honored and happy to be here. American Baby tells a story, as Margaret said, about adoption in the post-war era. But let me just start a little bit with my own backstory. I was born in the mid-1960s, and I grew up around a lot of adopted people, neighbors and cousins and classmates from elementary school all the way through graduate school. But I never stopped to wonder about why I knew so many adopted people and what the process really was until I was a newspaper reporter in my home state of Oregon in 2007, assigned to cover a story about an adopted man named David Rosenberg, who was getting a kidney donation from a friend. He was a cantor at a large Portland synagogue and invited me to come meet him for the first time at a dialysis center, where he told me that he hoped the story would go viral, that his birth mother would somehow see the story and recognize him as her son, so he could learn more medical history for himself and his 3 kids. The only thing he knew about his genetic past was that his mother, as he put it, was a Jewish girl in trouble in New York City in 1961, and that she had, again, his words, given him up for adoption through the Louise Wise Agency, which you may remember from the Triplets movie. And that was it. The story did not go viral in the way that David had hoped, but he and I became friends in the meantime. And in 2014, he called me with big news. He had taken a DNA test linked with a very distant cousin who very skillfully was able to locate Margaret. And he learned that the story he'd been told his entire life was really reversed at that point. His birth parents had married. Margaret Earl Katz had married her high school boyfriend, David's birth father, George Katz. They'd gone on to have 3 more children, including a baby sister who, like David, had made a vocal career. She was an opera singer in Berlin. David was thrilled with this news. He was overjoyed to be able to finally meet his mother and baby sister, as he put it. But he was also angry at the forces that had separated him from his birth family for so long. He was 52 years old, and his adoptive parents, whom he loved very, very much, had long since died, and there had been these years of mystery for him. So he turned to me. I'm an investigative reporter, and he asked me to look into the secrecy laws that had separated him from his birth family for so long. And as we all know, during the baby boom, American husbands and wives were procreating at a very prolific rate, fueling the greatest demographic boom in our history, the baby boom. But in an era of no sex education, very little birth control, even for some married couples, and illegal abortion, a lot of unmarried young American women got pregnant too. In the growing middle class of the post-war years, shotgun weddings were out of the question, and the estimated 4 million young women who got pregnant out of wedlock, as it was called then, were forced to surrender their sons and daughters into a coercive and exploitative adoption system that ran nationwide. So that's what I explore, but I explore it through the narrative of both David, his family, and Margaret Earl Katz and hers. And we have some slides here that help illustrate that story. So here is a photograph of Margaret Earl and George Katz as high schoolers. Margaret Earl was the daughter of German Jewish refugees who grew up in Upper Manhattan, quite literally in the Heights. And George was the son of 2 Holocaust survivors from Vienna. Both of their parents disapproved of their dating, and so they did what teenagers do, and they snuck around. In fact, just before that photograph was taken, Margaret climbed down the fire escape to be able to go to prom with George Katz. And one thing led to another. The teenagers fell in love, and they had sex for the first time about 10 months later. And Margaret got pregnant the very first time she'd had intercourse. Her horrified, stern mother was absolutely furious. She took her to Louise Wise, which then suggested that she go to the Lakeview Home for Unwed Jewish Mothers. And that's on the second slide, I think. There we go. Margaret and George loved each other very much. They were completely caught unawares by what had happened to them. The extent of Margaret's sex education at that point, she was 16, had been essentially her mother telling her to cover herself up with a sweater and don't give men the wrong idea. So she had no idea what was happening in her body, what reproduction actually entailed. She wasn't even sure she had sex, but she missed her periods and began trying to conceal the pregnancy from her mother. And Margaret was sent to a punitive maternity home that, like about 200 that operated nationwide for these young women who'd gotten pregnant. It operated like pretty much like a low security prison. Girls were given chores. They were taught sewing and crocheting and told never, ever, ever to tell anyone about what had happened to them there. And when it came time for Margaret to deliver her baby, she went into labor, was told to finish her chores. She was sweeping at the time, and to grit through her contractions at night. And when she went to the hospital the next day, she was knocked out, strapped down, not in that order. She was strapped down first and then knocked out. And when she finally delivered the baby, she went on to call Stephen in honor of an ancestor named Solomon. She was told that she was not able to hold him. So Margaret was not allowed to hold her baby. She and George were very, very much in love. They did everything they could to try to keep custody of their child. Margaret was harassed and badgered by social workers from both Louise Wise and the city of New York to try to surrender away her parental rights. At that time in New York City, the waiting list for adoptive parents there were about 10 couples per child. Margaret had no way of knowing this because adoption was completely a mystery to her. Nobody explained it to her. All they ever did was try to get her to sign the papers. And one day in May of 1962, Margaret and George went to see their baby. They were able to make some visits when he was in foster care. They went to a city office downtown, and I think we can go to the third slide now. And George was a pitcher, a very gifted pitcher who'd won a baseball scholarship to Ohio State, and he was winning things at arcades, blenders and toasters, and trying to taking Polaroid photographs to convey that he and Margaret were fit parents. They may be teenagers, but they were absolutely going to be able to prepare for their baby. And in the very instant that George was taking this photograph, Margaret was sequestered away into a room by herself. A social worker told her that a diplomat wanted to adopt her baby that very week. She resisted. She said, no, George and I are in love. We want to get married. We love our baby. We want to keep him. We'll do anything we can to get custody back of him. And the social worker pulled out the last final stop. At that moment in New York State, up until 1971, actually, it was a criminal act for minors to have premarital sex. Margaret was a month away from her 18th birthday, and the social worker clearly had that on her mind. She said, if you don't sign these papers today, we will send you to juvie. And for Margaret, that was the final straw. The choice she had was essentially no choice. And she signed away the rights to her son, not knowing that she would not see him for a very, very long time. Next slide shows Margaret and George having gotten married. They had a synagogue wedding in November 1963. All of this time, more than about a year and a half had passed. Margaret was convincing herself that her baby was being raised in the splendor of embassies in Europe, and she tried to convince herself that she had done the right thing, but that maybe somehow there was a chance that she and George, once they were married, would be able to get him back. What they didn't know is that their son's original birth certificate, Stephen's, the document that told Stephen gave him his link to his genes and to his mother, had been sealed. Like in 48 other states, 47 other states, New York had a system of dual birth certificates when an adoption took place. And what it did was seal off, as I said, the original document that gave a child the understanding of who he or she was, and then issued a second amended birth certificate listing the child's adoptive name and his adoptive parents as the original mother and father. This created a very thick line between birth families and adoptive families. It was supposed to protect a child from the taint of illegitimacy, the mother from the shame of her wanton past, but also to reassure adoptive families that no one wouldn't interfere with their newly created family. Margaret and George set up house in the Bronx, not all the while believing that their son was in Europe, as I said, maybe even possibly in Israel as a baby pioneer. But the reality was that David or George, I mean, Stephen had been adopted by Romanian Holocaust survivors who were no diplomats. They were loving people, and they lavished him with attention and care and love and everything he possibly could have ever wanted. But they lived in a humble apartment 10 blocks from where Margaret and George had set up their new apartment. Margaret got pregnant a second time and had a baby girl in the fall of 1964. And Margaret was a respectable housewife and wife and mother. And almost every day she took her baby daughter and her toy poodles to the park where David Rosenberg was playing, in all likelihood, with his adoptive mother, which was sort of equidistant between their two apartments. And Margaret and George had another child, a son, who they named Mark. And then they did what so many other Americans were doing at that point. They moved out of the city and into a bucolic little town in central Jersey, where Margaret became a pillar of the community. She was a member of the school board and her synagogue board, and she was the neighborhood mother to almost everyone. They had a third child, their daughter Sherry, and Margaret in the late 1970s, early 1980s, started becoming politicized to the adoptee rights movement. Adoptees were activating for access to their original birth certificates in New York and New Jersey. Margaret began going to meetings, started this long process of trying to locate her son's records in the New York City Public Library. That's too complicated to get into at this moment, but was unable to get very far, and ultimately decided that as a 37-year-old woman who had diligently called Louise Wise with every single illness on both sides of the family, that there clearly was a file for her son, and that she would just be able to go and add her contact information to the details that she had conveyed about there being reproductive cancers in the family tree, about there being diabetes in the family tree, autoimmune disorders, and gout, among others. And on a cold winter day, not long after Stephen/David's 20th birthday, Margaret took the bus into New York City, went to Louise Wise, the elegant Upper East Side brownstone. She walked up the front steps. The only time she'd been there before, she had to go in the discreet back entrance for young pregnant women. And she rang the buzzer several times, was ignored. Finally, a receptionist or a secretary told her that she threatened her again with the crime of loving her son. And when Margaret was pleading to try to enter the building and leave her name and telephone number and address, whoever was answering on the other side of the intercom told her that she was trespassing, and if she didn't leave, they would call the police. Margaret was understandably devastated, but left the rest of her searching to, she's a spiritual person, and the only thing she could think to do was to pray that one day she would be able to meet her son. That didn't happen until 2014 in Portland, Oregon. And mother and son were able to reunite 3 months before David died of some of the very illnesses about which Margaret had tried to warn him. It was an incredibly bittersweet reunion. David was thrilled to be able to make contact with his birth family, to know that he had been loved and wanted and cherished by two families. And he was delighted beyond measure to be able to meet his little sister. But the fact of the matter was that mother and son had been separated by cultural and social and legal factors that persist to this day. And that's what we hoped to draw attention to with the writing of this book. In 40 states, adult adoptees are still not allowed to obtain the original documents that tell them who they are and to whom they were born. And from Washington and California, believe it or not, two very liberal states, to Texas and Florida, and so many others in between, adult adopted men and women do not have that human and civil right. So we hope to draw attention to that with stories like this one. And I fully believe that people should not ever have to be secrets.
Wow, that was a fascinating story. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here with you tonight. I have so many questions, and I know that people who are joining us tonight also have many questions. So as you heard at the top, if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A channel here in the Zoom bar down below. Also, people who wrote ahead of time, lots of questions ahead of time, I'm going to be incorporating those into our conversation. And I really look forward to it because you bring up so many important points. Let's just dig into some of the themes that you're talking about here. And the first one that I think we should get into is that this is not just one story. This is one story that reflects millions and millions and millions of stories across the country. Can you just talk about how common this was?
So let's just back up a little bit on the math. So between 1944 and the early 1960s, an estimated 4 million young women got pregnant. And the vast majority of those, as I said earlier, were sent away into this coercive system to surrender their sons and daughters. But if you think about 4 million birth mothers and 4 million sons and daughters, then you add to that 4 million birth fathers, 4 million adoptive mothers, 4 million adoptive fathers, all of the siblings, aunts, uncles, and cousins. I have heard many, many estimates that say as many as 1/6 of Americans are directly touched by adoption. So that's millions of people. It's not just the adoptee and his or her birth parents and his or her adoptive parents.
And after you tell me that story, it makes me think that many of those people who are touched in this way probably don't even know it.
Right.
Yeah. I think the culture of this time in American history is important to take a look at as well. This was just before the sexual revolution, or actually maybe this was the start of the sexual revolution. This was after the post-war boom. What role did the history of the time play in all of this?
Oh, it was extraordinary. In the years in the 1920s and 30s, if a young woman had gotten pregnant out of wedlock, shotgun wedding, and what do you know, 6 months later, a full term, like healthy 7-pound, 6-ounce baby was born. Wink, wink, wink. But suddenly in the post-war era, there was an incredible new conservative social construct that occurred. And if you think about what popular culture was conveying to Americans at the time, Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore and Lucy and Desi slept in separate beds. They were parents, but yet, and at the heart and at the center of this big baby boom, but yet they were sleeping in separate beds. And so, as you said, the sexual revolution was just around the corner, but it really was already simmering. GIs had come back from World War II, unlikely to have been celibate during their time of service, and they were even more unlikely to want to be chaste with their stateside girlfriends. And there were cultural factors, rock and roll was booming, and also the middle class was moving to the suburbs, and teenagers had privacy for the first time in many in almost ever. They had suburban rec rooms, they had the back seats of the family Buick, and there were ample opportunities to explore sexuality without any knowledge of where it would lead.
But what they didn't have was access to abortion, access to birth control. I mean, even married couples would have trouble getting access to birth control, no sex education, right?
Right.
I mean, what options did these young women have? Any?
Absolutely none. As just like Margaret was sent off to one of these 200 maternity homes nationwide, as were so many millions of others. If they didn't have access to one of these maternity homes, many of them were sent to take care of a sick aunt or a relative in the country. And there was so much secrecy and shame surrounding this very basic biology that no one wanted to look at it for decades. All of the shame and secrecy laid at the heart of a woman. The men did not really ever, they escaped. I don't want to say escape, but they certainly didn't have the punitive mark on their pasts that these women had. There were certainly always whispers, and sometimes women just up and recreated a life in a different place to get away from their shame.
Well, I think this might be an appropriate time for me to say, and you know this, that my mother was one of these young women, and I didn't know that until about 2 years ago. She called me out of the blue and said, "I have something to tell you. Are you sitting down? You have a half sister that nobody in our family knows about at all." And I remember she was telling me this story, and she thought she was going to go to her grave with it, right? Because she was so ashamed of it. She was so utterly ashamed of it. She was so grief-stricken for 50 years. I wonder what that burden means for women and families that carried this secret with them. How do you carry that shame that you were talking about for so many decades and find any way to heal through that trauma?
Well, because for so many women, it was unspoken. I think the way that they could cope was to compartmentalize this grief of a lost child. Margaret, for example, was told frequently when she was in the process of pregnancy and shortly thereafter, she was told, "Don't worry about it, you'll forget it, and you'll go on to have children of your own one day." So that was the carrot for these young women. We're going to help you get through this. This is the best for everybody involved. Don't worry. And nobody ever has to know about this. Make like it never happened.
Yeah.
And you can't forget a child to whom you've given birth. I would go so far as to say that's almost a biological impossibility.
This next question comes from someone in the audience who wrote in beforehand, and it comes from the perspective of an adoptee. And the question is, what is the main driving force behind an adoptee's need to know their biological history? In other words, a history that they don't have access to in many cases. What's behind that?
Oh, I think it's one of the most natural questions that any of us ever have is, who are we? Where do we come from? What is my origin story? And for so many adoptees adopted during this period, their origin stories were stolen. And it's not to say that they didn't have wonderful lives with their adopted parents, that they had advantages they may not have been able to have access to if they had been raised by teenage parents. What they did get was a different life. They were often promised a better life, but it was a different life. And it was a life that was uprooted from their biological origins. It's right now we're speaking to a genealogical society, and it's not a mystery. It's not a secret in this country that genealogy, 23andMe, Ancestry, all of those websites and tracking one's family roots are the second most common pastime, at least on the internet, after pornography and right up there with gardening.
So let's talk about the process of the adoption and the experience that this family went through. And I want you to explain more about these agencies. You described them as predatory. They were also making tremendous amounts of money in the process. What were the motivations, besides the cultural stuff that we've been speaking about, what were the motivations of these agencies to do this and to hold on to the secrecy as much as they did?
Well, it benefited them, of course, because the adoptive parents, this was a transaction. It's really painful to actually look at human beings as if they were a commodity. But in those years after the war, certainly that's how it was. That's how it was. And I spent a lot of time in archives, just poring over documentation, not only from Louise Wise, but so many other adoption agencies. And children were referred to as the product. And earlier, I had made mention of the fact that there were, at least in New York City, there were 10 waiting families for every baby. And the way that the agencies were able to make money was to string the process out as long as it possibly could be. Adoptive parents were kept on the hook. They had to pay to stay on a waiting list in order for the adoption agencies to actually physically match what they believed was the proper infant with the proper family. There was an extremely paternalistic approach to it all, where adoption agencies really acted as if they were and proud of the fact that they were playing God and could present a waiting family with a child that was almost, and I found this in documentation, almost better than one that nature could have provided herself. It's shocking, but that's how they looked at it.
And they lied. I mean, there was no diplomat family, right? I mean, that's remarkable. Another question from the audience here that I want to bring in. This is related. Were the social workers involved? Were they trained professionals? What did social work look like in those days? You know, maybe compared to what we see today.
That's a great question. Social work in the years after the war had grown out of the early 20th century in crowded Eastern cities that needed a place to take care of families and children who were being orphaned by real disease that was happening in tenement housing and in factory work. And it grew, the social workers from the post-war era had grown out of this epoch in American history where there was really a crisis about where to put children whose parents had died of typhus or diphtheria. But in terms of their training, they did have college educations. It was required at the time, but they were also, from what I understand and from many of the interviews that I did among women who were engaged in adoption social work at the time, there was a sense that it was one woman very blatantly told me, we felt like we were on the admissions team at Harvard. We loved the power that was bestowed upon us as young women who could help decide who got a baby and when, and which family to place this child with or that child with.
Well, and so much has changed, as we know, in the system. This next question from an audience member is again related to this, that the social workers, you know, things that we would never have happen today were happening then. So for instance, the question is, why was I not able to hold my son at birth? And I assume this person is speaking from their own personal experience, obviously. Was that to protect my emotions or to protect his future without me?
Wow, that is a really great question as well. And I think the belief of the moment of the day was that somehow if a mother was cut off from in any way bonding with her child, it would be easier for her to go on and forget. And of course, that wasn't actually the case. But as you said earlier, Peter, there was a lot of deception going on in all directions. Mm. The birth mothers were lied to, adoptive parents were lied to, everybody was lied to.
Well, and I just want to make a brief announcement. In just a moment, we're going to have a very special guest join us. But I do have one more question from the audience listening in right now. It gets to what you're saying right here. What were the adoptive parents being told? Did they have any idea that the babies they were adopting, you know, had come from this sort of situation?
No, they were typically told, they were misled into believing that the young women were all high achieving college students who were either concert pianists. In the case of Margaret, the Rosenbergs were told that she was an aspiring science student. They sort of made it sound as if she was on her way to medical school and going to be a fabulous young doctor one day. And in other cases, there were children who'd been born to women who were institutionalized in psychiatric hospitals. And they were also, the parents were also misled routinely about the origin stories of those.
Great, thank you. Well, let's just take a moment and see if we can do some Zoom magic here and bring in our special guest. Oh, there we go. There we go. I don't know if people can see here, we have Margaret Earl Katz with us today. Of course, the heroine of the story of this just absolutely amazing book. Margaret, welcome to you. What's it like to hear the conversation that we're having today, to know that Gabrielle has written this beautiful story about your family and it's starting to get out there in the world? What's this process been like for you?
It's been extremely informative and amazing, and I'm just grateful that so many people are able to see what really happened. I had no idea until Gabrielle started her research. I mean, basically the first time I had any idea was when David contacted me, and I found out he never got any information about me or our family. He never got any information about any of the medical problems, nothing. His adoptive parents never got anything. And when I realized that, and David and I spoke, we said, this has to get out there, that other people who have gone through what we went through, whether it was the adoptee, the birth parents, or the adoptive parents, know the truth, that everything was just lies and hidden. And so that's the main reason that I agreed to the New York Times article first and then to the book, because I feel the average person has no idea, including people even who are in the triangle and the extended families. Like with you, it was a half sister. And, I went through the same thing your mother went through. We were basically told, forget it ever happened. You can't forget it ever happened. But there was no way to find out. People in our age group, we didn't have DNA or anything at that point to look up. And, going to Alma was the first time I knew about looking up in the library for the number on the birth certificate. And that was, Gabrielle's book, I believe, explains it. I mean, it was an unbelievable process. And the first thing when he called me, and he said the same thing that your mother said to you, are you sitting down? When we reached each other. And I blurred out the 4 numbers. And, he had it on his birth certificate, that was like the only way of finding. And, it just wasn't available when I went to look.
Can you, I know a lot of people who are listening tonight have some personal interest, or maybe this story touches their own families in some ways, and maybe they're searching in a way that you were searching. The moment it came to be that you had found your son again, and you had that conversation for the first time, and you heard his voice for the first time, what did that feel like?
It was wonderful. It was such a relief. I mean, just him calling and, leaving the message, please call me back, and to hear the voice. And, then when he said, I think you're my mother, I mean, it was just like, he's alive, he's okay. Because I was having nightmares constantly, the same nightmare. And you try to put it out of your head. You try to say, you're just imagining this, but I kept imagining he was under a staircase screaming for me. I would wake up in the middle of the night screaming, and, I could speak to my husband, but that was it. And it was just horrible. So I can imagine what so many other people are going through, on both the adoptee side and also the birth parent side.
Yeah. A lot of people are wondering, have written in ahead of time, and also are asking us now, where do I start? How do I do this? If I have someone I'm looking for, what's your advice to families who are searching, who haven't had luck, who have had who've hit a roadblock, or maybe just have a little bit of information, like a hospital and a birth date? Margaret, I'll ask you, but then maybe Gabrielle could also weigh in as well.
Gabrielle probably has more. There are many adoptee groups out there, like Adoptees United, and some of the places will help you with the searches. There are also search angels. There's a lot of options. As far as the DNA, when I did mine after, David wasn't even on my list, and this was 23andMe. So, it was lucky because the person that was listed as a fourth or fifth cousin was a search angel. So we were really, really lucky.
Let's talk about search angels real quick. Gabrielle, what can you tell us about them, and also the process of searching for people who are just starting out?
Yes, so search angels are people in the adoptee rights community who are dedicated to looking at strands of DNA and being able to locate. They also oftentimes they have access to legal records and not just legal records, but identity information on, like, Accurant, for example, that are actual people search engines. And what I would suggest, and certainly anybody can contact me through my website or find me through Twitter, I'm happy to help direct people to the right place. But what I suggest is, if you are in a state that is not open, if you were adopted in one of the 40 states in which you're not able to obtain your birth certificate, you should take all three, 23andMe, Ancestry.com, and Family Tree DNA, to look for any connection you possibly can. This to me sounds like a ludicrous response, because it requires someone in your direct family line to have also sent their saliva off to a big tech company, and to trust in that to be able to maybe find your birth mother, your child, your father. But right now it is the tool that we have. And these search angels, as I said, there are armies of them in the United States who help reunite adoptees with their birth families.
Gabrielle, can you talk about where we stand across the country in state legislatures? Are politicians starting to realize that these closed records are causing a lot of people a lot of pain? Is there any change happening?
There is change happening, and that's the good news. New York, for example, just last year opened its records to adoptees, and Maryland just last month in May, not Maryland, Connecticut, sorry, voted overwhelmingly to grant adoptees the right to obtain these documents. But Maryland knocked it down in April. They just said, no, we need to protect the privacy of birth mothers. And the irony of that is,
do you think they want to be protected?
No.
Yeah.
Fewer than 0.5% in states in which women are allowed to redact their names from original birth certificates have chosen to do so. And this is an issue that has crossed blue-red state divides. Oregon, for example, very blue, cobalt blue, and Alabama, vermilion, both have passed laws allowing granting adoptees access to their original birth certificates. But in California, Texas, Washington State, Florida, Minnesota, even some adoptees in Massachusetts, depending on your birth year, are still stalled in legislatures and are unable to access these documents.
We have some other great questions coming in from the audience. I'm going to direct this to Margaret. People would like to know, For your other children, how did they react when they heard this news and when they met David?
There were different reactions from all of them. The first thing, everybody was shocked because, I had kept this a secret for so long.
I can relate, yeah.
I kept it a secret because there was nothing I could do. As soon as David contacted me, I let the kids know. And they all spoke and text with David and FaceTimed and with the family. Sherry ended up being the closest because she flew home. She canceled a couple of her opera gigs in Europe and flew home because I was not able to fly to David by myself.
Mm-hmm.
And the two of them just, they were almost like twins. And, it was just amazing. It was amazing. But I just feel extremely, extremely blessed because he died way too soon. But I still got to meet him. I know he had wonderful adoptive parents, and I'm so grateful to that. And he knew where he came from. And to me, that was just wonderful.
Right. You saying that makes me wonder, time is so precious and so fleeting, and you almost missed this opportunity. You went a whole lifetime wondering, and then you just had a little bit of time to catch up and to get to know each other. Have you reflected on what your life would have been like if you hadn't gotten the answers you were seeking?
I would have taken probably, I was like your mom. Do I take this to my deathbed? Because it was just indoctrinated in us. And with me, your mom told you right away. It was a matter of, why do we have to hurt our other children if we have no knowledge, if there's nothing we can do? And so now I'm on the bandwagon where any way I can help any, adoptees or any organizations, I'm ready to do it because this should not still be going on.
Yeah. Gabrielle, this is an amazing story, and although it ended sadly with David's death, it feels so joyful that there was this reunion. How common is it in these types of stories, when families do have a reunion that they've been seeking for so many years, that it goes as well as Margaret's did?
Well, it's really complicated to have decades and decades, and like in David's case, 52 years of separation. There's a lot of deferred love and misunderstanding that takes place in both directions. Oftentimes, adoptees the narrative that they have subsumed, that they've internalized, is that they were rejected by their birth parents, regardless of what the circumstances are. So the knowledge that one has as a young child, and that you sort of inherently repeat about being not good enough for your own mother to keep you, is one that's really difficult to overcome, regardless of how joyful a meeting might be. There's still so much pain. There's the loss on the side of the birth parents. There's the immense loss of the lack of genetic connection that an adoptee has had in these closed, secretive adoptions. And it's really, really, really difficult and complicated to bridge that gap. It's not just always a soap opera of, oh, look, see, now you know each other, happy reunion, let's go on. It's very rarely that way, in fact.
So, Margaret, maybe you have advice for people for managing expectations. I'm sure that's something you were thinking about extensively before, your reunion happened. How did you manage your expectations for how it may or may not go?
I really don't think I dwelled on it at all. As soon as David and I spoke, it was like we knew each other. It was just, I think he could feel the love that I always had for him. And that made, I think, things much easier. As far as expectations, nothing's ever easy. And, different families and different people in each family are going to react differently. To me, I just feel I was so blessed. And it also made me realize that what I did wasn't so terrible because he went to good people and they loved him and they took good care of him. And he gave back to the world. And he left, a good name and such a wonderful memory of him behind. So to me, it turned out good. Nothing is going to ever be perfect. You're going to have people who think it's wonderful. You're going to have people who think it's not good. But this is part of life. And I think it's better to know than not know. And then once you know, or the families are connected, no matter what part of the family, things can be great at first. It could change after. But you have this with any family. But I think the fact on all sides, it's very important for people to know where they came from, who they were, and most likely there'll probably be a lot more good things because so many of us, our lives were basically controlled by the agencies and the government. So I don't know. It's up to each person and to each family. But I was like your mother. I thought, I would die not knowing. And Gabrielle has interviewed people who are, in their 90s and don't know.
I can't even imagine. Yeah. Listen, we've got time for one more question before we wrap up and say goodbye for the evening. Gabrielle, I was hoping you might be able to reflect on the legacy that this system has had on our country, on American families over the last 50 and 60 years. I mean, the system has changed clearly, but the legacy is still there. That might be a good place to wrap up.
Yeah, the legacy is definitely still there. And the one thing that comes back to me time and time again is that people shouldn't be secrets. I said that before, but I think there needs to be, especially at this moment of social reckoning that we're coming to as a nation, equality should be ubiquitous. I truly believe, and I hope that when it comes to trying to changing our society, we can also take a deep look at what we did to women, to their sons and daughters, and rectify it as swiftly as possible. And to me, it's absolutely an anachronistic. It's ludicrously anachronistic that we still have these laws in place. And I hope we can draw attention to the fact that they're still on the books in so many states.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wow, that was such a wonderful conversation, really remarkable. And I admire all the truth telling and all of the secrets and so much to ponder here. The Q&A has been lighting up. And I do say to those of you who haven't gotten your questions answered, we're going to be sharing a few with Gabrielle. We have another event of adoption coming up. We'll try to get to those questions. But heading toward the end of our time together, I wanted to shift now after saying a tremendous thanks to Peter and to Margaret Earl Katz. We are enormously grateful for your time tonight and for your being with us. But we are going to move toward closing. And Gabrielle, if you could share some last words from the book before we wrap up and yell it right into the computer. I feel like 80% of the people can hear fine and then 20% can't. So let's try to capture the 20%. Over to you.
Sorry about that. I'll vocalize better. The story of Margaret Earl Katz and David Rosenberg does not have a tidy ending. It was never a tidy story. But today, Margaret is at home in the house where she raised her children, where she dreamed of David playing with his siblings. She surrounds herself with images of things that matter to her the most, and the only thing that ever mattered to her, photographs of her complete family, all 4 kids, and now 6 grandchildren. Sometimes at night, when Margaret is alone, she listens to CDs that David gave her. On them, she can hear her son sing the ancient melodies of their ancestors, full of bittersweet longing for peace. She closes her eyes as she listens, envisioning him as the strong young man he once was, comforted by their brief shared memories and her ability to immerse him in her love. She listens as the singing mounts and descends, summoning the divine. It is the voice of her son, so long lost, and so very fleetingly found.
What an amazing family story. It's a story of love. It's a story of a long road traveled. And that in itself is, I think, really inspirational, the love and the determination that it took on both sides. Thank you, Gabrielle, for sharing Margaret's story. We are so grateful to you for tonight. And just a reminder to those of you out there, if you enjoyed this evening, signed copies of American Baby can be purchased through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge. Again, use the coupon code AMINSP20 as you order online, and they'll waive the shipping fee for media mail. We at American Ancestors are delighted to have presented tonight's event. If you are researching your family, if you're tracing an adoption or pondering DNA results, which I know a lot of you are, I could tell from the chat, you might find our library and our education center to be useful. Our stacks on Newbury Street are now open, or you can visit our digital archives anytime. You can also connect with one of our genealogists 9 to 5 each weekday, or join in an educational program from our Brew Family Learning Center. All of this online through AmericanAncestors.org. For those of you who are interested in the topic of adoption, it looks as if we'll be doing an in-depth program, a conversation course on just that, possibly even with Gabrielle, with her new computer. So keep an eye out on November, and we will also alert you to that. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and to connect people. So please let us connect with you if you need help. In the American Inspiration Author Series, we're presenting more virtual author talks in partnership with the Boston Public Library, with the State Library, and the GBH Forum Network. I'm also talking to WBUR about one event. On June 28, we're welcoming the best-loved Canadian historian Stephen Bown with his history of Canada and the Hudson's Bay Company. I've just finished the book, and I must say it also holds great tales about this country and not just about beaver trapping and Boston sea captains trying their luck up north. The book explores as well the Oregon and Washington territories and shares much about the 49th parallel, how it moved around and why. Stephen will be in dialogue with Jeff Breithaupt, the Canadian-born songwriter, author, and podcaster now living in New York City. We'll be celebrating Canada Day with them just a few days early. On July 8th, we're back here in Boston with Boston Globe former journalist Peter S. Canalos, and Carlo Rotello will be exploring America's history. Carlo Rotello coming to us from Boston College, American Studies, and English professor. These two gentlemen are going to take us back to America's Gilded Age, the Kentucky home life and professional good works of Supreme Court Justice John Marshall Harlan. We'll look at as well at his forward-thinking dissenting opinions, what got stopped and what progressed on his watch. Trust busting, Plessy versus Ferguson, it all happened then under his watch. So come back to learn more about him and that time. And on July 27, we're welcoming author and New York Magazine executive editor Dorothy Wickenden with her book, The Agitators, 3 friends who fought for abolition and women's rights. Join us to hear the stories of Harriet Tubman, Martha Wright, Frances Seward, all of them neighbors in Auburn, New York during the Civil War. In addition to their good works, these women wrote extensively and to each other. They intersected personally and professionally with President Lincoln, Daniel Webster, Frederick Douglass, Charles Sumner, John Brown, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and of course, William Lloyd Garrison. Don't miss hearing about them, their contemporaries, and this extraordinary time in American history. Okay, back to tonight and to this century. Thank you, Gabrielle, again. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Margaret, for this remarkable evening about family and America's more recent cultural history. And to all of you out there this evening, thank you for your interest and for your questions. We wish all of you at home, wherever you are, a good evening and sunny, inspirational days ahead. From all of us around Boston, across the New York and New Jersey area, and from Peter out in Arizona, yes, he's in Arizona, we wish you all a very good night. Thank you again for coming.